Here we go. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Again, I'm Susie Wampler, Regional Coordinator for Jazz in Southwest here in Southern California. If you haven't already, let us know where you're tuning in from. Again, we'll be recording. We've already started. The video will be on our website later today, where you can catch up with anything you missed if you came in later, if you have any difficulties with sound later on. Again, enter your questions in the chat box, starting with the word question to make it easier to spot. And I want to let you know our next event is going to be Saturday, March 27th at 11 a.m. Pacific time. We will welcome Karen Yamashita, author of Sensei and Sensibility. And registration will be going out next week, so be on the lookout for that. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Nancy Mowll Mathews is the Eugénie Prendergast Senior Curator of 19th and 20th Century Art, Emerita, at the Williams College Museum of Art. She received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, where she began her long career as a preeminent Cassatt scholar. Of the more than 15 books and exhibitions she has produced, the best known are Cassatt and Her Circle, Selected Letters, Cassatt, The Color Prints, and Mary Cassatt, Alive. Most recently, she curated and co-wrote a catalog for Mary Cassatt and American Impressionist in Paris for the Jacquemart-André Museum in Paris in 2018. In addition to her work on Cassatt, she has authored or co-authored numerous books on Maurice and Charles Prendergast, Paul Gauguin, and the relationship between art and early film. And now it's my pleasure again to welcome Nancy Mowll Mathews. And I think you're mute. You need to unmute, Nancy.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good. I have a very soft voice, and so I have an added microphone here. So if anybody can't hear me, you should be able to hear me. Make sure you check your own sound, because that happens to be a lot. It's just, a matter of cranking up the volume all around. So I am very happy to be doing this today, and I thank Susie and Janet so much for inviting me and for making it so easy to participate in this conversation. I have learned a lot. I have to say that I started this project as a Janeite, and these are my books, my Austen books. You can see I have the Chapman set. I got that when I was in college 50 years ago. And you can see the volumes are battered. I lost my Emma because I lent it to somebody, as you do, and then you never get it back. I even have the spin-offs, particularly you'll notice Twilight, which I consider definitely a spin-off. But in preparing this talk, I realized that being a Janeite, being a fan, was not good enough. I really had to learn something in a scholarly way about Jane Austen. So I have tried to make myself into an Austen scholar. But those of you who really are Austen scholars, I look forward to your feedback. And if you can help me in any way with some of the questions that I have about the Austen, mostly documentation, because as you heard from my introduction, I'm a real documenting kind of person, kind of gal. For Cassatt, I did her letters, I published her letters, I published her biography, I did a catalogue raisonné of her color prints, which is these books back here. And so I really care about tracing things to their original source. Why is it that we know, or we think we know, something about a particular historical figure? And so doing this talk, it struck me, and it even more strikes me today as I'm giving the talk, how complicated it is to work from home in a medium that goes out to the rest of the world. It's mind-boggling. It's disorienting. Here I am sitting here in my house, in my home office, talking to my computer. talking to my slides. I mean, right now I'm talking to Mary Cassatt and Jane Austen because they're on my screen. And they strike me, these little thumbnails that I have of Cassatt and Austen, as if they are part of our group here today. They're on the Zoom screen, just like the rest of us. So that makes them more approachable, more accessible. And we're going to spend today trying to figure out what are the connections between these two incredible women. These images that I'm showing you were published within about a decade of each other. And they are both the first time that these artists, I'm calling them artists, forgive me, the literary people, but I have to, that's my fallback term. These artists are, for the first time in these images, being part of a mass medium. Their images, their portraits are being broadcast around the world, or at least around the US in the case of the Mary Cassatt. And so how did these images get to where they were in that decade of the between 1870s and 1880s? And this is the connection between the two. This is a quote from a letter that Mary Cassatt wrote to her great friend Louisine Havemeyer, who was a collector and who donated her collection to the Metropolitan Museum. She was also a great suffragist, and so the two women were, had a lot in common and did a lot of things together. So in 1917, she writes to Louisine, quote, "It is hard to get anything interesting to read. I have here a novel I have been urged to try, quote, The House of Mirth, unquote, by Mrs. Wharton," obviously Edith Wharton. "Literally, I could not read it. Such an imitation of Bourget," and Bourget meaning Paul Bourget, who was a French writer, a writer I cannot endure, by the way. So a copy isn't made to please me. Those people aren't Americans. Here's Mary Cassatt. She has lived in France for 50 years at this point, but she's saying that Edith Wharton's characters aren't Americans. The heroine just such a one as Bourget makes, or rather the situations are. She tries James, that is Henry James, for the character. I would rather go back and read Miss Austen's novels over again for the 100th time. Dear, no art at home or here either. So this is a photograph of Mary Cassatt from the late teens, maybe around 1920. And you can see when she had opinions, she did not hesitate to voice them. But she did like Jane Austen, and she was a great reader. Here she is on the left with a newspaper. She read history, she read current events, she had strong political opinions, very much up on what was going on in the world. And she was a great reader of contemporary fiction. One of her favorite authors was Émile Zola, who she knew in Paris in the 1880s. And this is one of her paintings of a woman reading. She did many works featuring women reading. So it was extremely important to her. So how did she know Jane Austen? How did she get involved with Jane Austen? How did she become a Janeite? And I'm showing you here what she was doing around 1870 when the Jane Austen memoir was published by her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee. It was available in the US, but even beyond that, it was immediately written about or summarized in American periodical literature. Here's an article on the memoir on Jane Austen from Harper's Magazine in June of 1870. And so Cassatt, who actually had moved to Paris in 1865, happened to be back in the US by the end of 1870, because of the Franco-Prussian War. The Americans were advised to get out of France until the war was over, and so she did. She, as soon as she could, went back to Europe, and the photograph that you see here was taken in Parma in Italy, which by 1872 she was back in Europe. But at that moment, she was in an English-speaking country. Not that it mattered particularly. The Jane Austen novels in English could be obtained easily in Paris, where she spent most of her time, and throughout Europe. But I'm associating her with the reception of Jane Austen in her own country. And probably, and I'm just guessing this because of my own experience, I got my first Jane Austen novel, I think, when I was 12. But teenage is probably when most of us got into our Jane Austen reading. Here she is when a volume of, or a set of collected works was published by Ticknor and Fields in 1863, when Mary Cassatt would have been 19. And in Philadelphia, she was very, she was living in Philadelphia at the time. She was going to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, which she had signed up for when she was 15. It's very parallel to Jane Austen's starting to write her first books in her teens. And she was part of this incredible circle of other female artists and friends. And here they are in this photograph in the middle at the Pennsylvania Academy, making a cast of this guy's hand, who was the boyfriend of one of them. He was a doctor. And they were just incredibly full of life and fun, and believed that the world was theirs. So the Jane Austen novels appealed to them. This was perfect for this group of young, achieving women coming out of Philadelphia. And when you look at the paintings that she did by 1880, 10 years later, after she had returned to Europe, she was a member of the Impressionist group in Paris. Her best friend was Degas. She was very good friends with Berthe Morisot, and of course all of the Impressionist artists. And she was painting in an Impressionist style. And the kinds of themes that she took up were ones that are familiar to Jane Austen readers. She did a series of at the opera subjects where young women all dressed up in their finery go out to the opera, and not only, this is typical of a Jane Austen heroine, not only are they there to be looked at, to be flirted with, but they're there with their binoculars looking at everybody else and flirting or taking the initiative in the kinds of relationships that they're seeking as young women. But also the idea of being at home and visiting each other. The cup of tea on the left, which is in the Metropolitan Museum, and young woman or young girl at a window, which is in the National Gallery in Washington. These are both the visitors that we're looking at. And we can tell that because they're the ones with hats on. Anyone who doesn't have a hat is in residence, but the ones who do have hats have come in from the outside world. She also then went on to become world famous with her mother and child paintings. These happened to all be pastels, but it was this sense of the monumental woman, the great woman who is in control of her life. She tries to modernize the Madonna and Child theme, which of course she feels is one of the greatest artistic traditions in the world today, and of her time and still today. Cassatt and Austen did work at home. And they paint a great picture of what it was like to work at home And I'm showing you, when I show you Austen illustrations, I'm showing you illustrations from the 1890s, which would have been familiar to Cassatt probably, even though she probably had books that predated them, didn't need to go out and buy the new editions of the Jane Austen books. But she would have been familiar with the kinds of illustrations that were being made in the 1890s for them. But these artists in the later 19th century are grappling with the themes like what it was like to be at home and to work at home and to spend evenings at home, with everyone trying to find something, or not even trying to, but finding something that allowed them to be together and yet be apart, be in their own worlds. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet here are actually, have their backs to one another. Mrs. Bennet does not seem to have any sewing, but normally you would either have a book or you would have your needlework, and which is what we see in the Cassatt print on the right under the lamp. This is her mother and her sister in their Paris apartment. And each one of them has found something, some kind of work to keep them busy and keep them sane, so that they have their own psychological distance from each other. The larger groups are incredible. When you think of the 5 Bennet sisters from Pride and Prejudice with their mother and their father, and each one of them trying to read, trying to work on a hat, doing something that would allow them to have their own occupations in the midst of a crowd. Letter writing, of course, was one of them. Visiting was another one. And I like to think, one of my favorite scenes in all of Jane Austen's novels is the scene at Netherfield when Jane goes to visit the Bingley sisters and gets sick, and Elizabeth has to go and tend to her. And she spends an evening with the Bingleys and Mr. Darcy, and all of the interactions take place among all of those people at night in the drawing room. But one of the sentences that strikes me now, didn't strike me at the time, but strikes me now, was Bingley comes in. Jane is already seated there. Jane and Elizabeth are already in the parlor. Bingley then sat down by Jane and talked scarcely to anyone else. Elizabeth, at work in the opposite corner, saw it all with great delight. So the emphasis at work is mine. At work, at home, at that time, meant at needlework. Work essentially was working fabric, working cloth. And so Elizabeth had some kind of needlework at hand, and was sitting in the corner doing it. But in addition to that, she was an observer. She was watching Jane and Bingley. She saw it all with great delight. This concept of observing is something that is very important to Mary Cassatt's work, that particularly in these images of tea parties, of visiting. Remember, the ones with the hats are the visitors, the ones without the hats are the ones who live there. And here they are, they don't seem to be doing anything, but they are observing and they are thinking. And you wonder, what are they thinking? If you look closely at the faces, each one of them, and in a way, you're not sure you want to know what they're thinking, because it is judgmental, possibly. It is critical. It's taking it all in and being in control. If here you are in a room of people, but you have your own thoughts and your own work to do, so to speak. Now, so far, we've really looked at what you could do while you were in that room and communicating with the people in that room. But so much of what went on in that room referred to the outside world, but primarily letters. And I'm showing you one of the Brock illustrations for the scene where Caroline Bingley is talking to Mr. Darcy. She says, "You write uncommonly fast." And, this whole dialogue about how, what a great letter writer he was. And she says, "How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of the year. Letters of business too. How odious I should think them." And of course, then he says, well, it's a good thing you don't have to do them if you find them so odious. And the implication, or we tend to read this as a male-female dichotomy, that it's the men are writing letters of business, the women are writing letters of friendship or of family. And that may have been true to a certain extent. However, the two women we are talking about, Mary Cassatt and Jane Austen, did have their professional correspondence taking place at home with their publishers, with their dealers, with their collectors, with their colleagues. And so this is a part of their wider world of work. In a way, like our Zoom practices today, in that it emanates from home and goes out into the wider world. Mary Cassatt didn't do a lot of images of letter writing. The most famous one is the one that I used for to advertise the talk. And she's not writing in this image, she's just sealing the envelope. But this sense of being at home, also at a tiny desk, just like, presumably a desk that one of the heroines of Jane Austen's novels would have used. But thinking of her in her mind, she is somewhere else. And the fact that this is a print, it's a aquatint, dry point, hand colored, and part of a set, which makes a kind of narrative, not a real narrative, but you can go from print to print to print and see the activities of the women who are represented there. But not only is it a narrative, is it a story, is she thinking, but because it's based on Japanese art, which was so popular in France at the time, you even get the sense that she could be writing to other continents. In Mary Cassatt's case, definitely to the US, but there's even the sense that it could go all the way to Asia. So whatever is happening in the home with the letters, it's being communicated to the outside world. And here we have the idea of Jane Austen's writing table in Jane Austen's house, a Chris Hammond illustration for Sense and Sensibility, where Eleanor is at her drawing board, making art at home at a similar table to the one that Jane Austen used to write her novels. In the Mary Cassatt print, Mary Cassatt does not appear, but obviously she's there. She's on the other side of this table because she's the one who's drawing the image of her mother and her sister. So we're seeing actual work go on at home, the creation of the art that is meant, again, for the external world, like a letter. It happens at home, but it's meant to go out beyond that. And in this case, we are also going to include the portraits of Mary Cassatt and Jane Austen, which were typically done at home or give the impression that they're being done at home. but the portrait itself is like a letter or like a work of art or some kind of writing, in that it is meant to convey the ideas of and about the artist to the outside world. And these two images were the first time that both of these artists' images, their portraits, their faces, were distributed in a mass medium. For the Cassatt, it was published in a newspaper. For the Austen, it was published in a portrait gallery, a typical collection of prints, portrait prints, engravings of, in this case, eminent men and women of Europe and America, which was this particular one published in New York in 1873. So what are these images, these portraits intending to convey? If we're analyzing their art and their writing, let's analyze these portraits. The Cassatt, the newspaper that I'm showing here is the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, but it shows you, it's an example of how newspapers shared their content around the country, at least around the US, and even oftentimes articles are reprinted from Europe in American newspapers. So this article about about female artists, this is a top 10, so to speak, of women artists working, it's called New York Ladies, but of course, Cassatt at that time wasn't in New York, she was in Paris. And the artists who are represented here also were living elsewhere, but they were exhibiting in New York. So hence the excuse for putting them together. But this is an article that was originally in the New York World, in New York, and was sent out by telegraph or other method to newspapers all over the country. It was mass medium in the most possible way. Some of the other artists who are represented here are people like Rhoda Holmes Nichols, for instance, or Eliza Greatorix. And I'm saying that for any Americanists who are in the audience and wondering, who are those other women? But ironically, now, talking about the meaning of the portrait that is being sent out, here she is being, conveyed to the whole country. But the article, what's written about her, actually confines her back into her house. So it says, little is known of her work by the general public. Excuse me? Here's an article that's just gone out to the whole country. And they say, little is known of her work by the general public. And it passes directly from her studio into the hands of her family and their friends. And again, excuse me, here is somebody who has just exhibited with the Impressionists in Paris. They were the most famous group of artists, modern artists in France, in Europe at that time. And she was very active in setting up the exhibitions. And so then they say, but in any public exhibition she chances to appear in, she holds her own as one of the most individual and striking artists her sex has produced. So it's it's a little bit of a backhanded compliment. She's basically, a refined young lady who only works for her family, and yet she holds her own if she happens to exhibit with other people. But where did the portrait come from? We do not know. It strikes me, the way these things were done, someone must have given the New York World a photograph of Mary Cassatt, which she would have had to have had taken in Paris, because that's where she was, and then sent to New York to be engraved and put into the newspaper. It's a little bit like the self-portrait that we see on the left, which is in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. A similar kind of pose, the little bow at the neck and a hat. But it's obviously not exactly like that. It's a different hat, a different bow at the neck. But you can see from the other self-portrait, which is on the left, and the photograph on the right, which we've already seen before, she had a very distinct look. Her face was kind of doughy, especially when she was younger. A little nose, kind of fat cheeks, a little bee-stung lips. The engraving doesn't have any of those characteristics. You would never have recognized her if you knew Mary Cassatt and saw this in the paper. So again, here she is, she's thinking she's going to break out into the whole wide world. And yet the portrait doesn't look anything like her. It's really not her. And the text is also not her. So, it's a compromise. Here she's glad that she's gotten the recognition, but on the other hand, it's not really her. So after this, she has a policy of not providing photographs. If someone's going to write about her, she declines the invitation to provide a photograph. Uh, um, one of the reasons is that she didn't feel like she was in control of her own image. And a great example of that is the portrait that was done of her by her friend Edgar Degas. Clearly, she sat for this portrait. She agreed to it. He gave it to her. She had it for 30 years. But in 1912, she decided to get rid of it. And look at what she said to her dealer, Durand-Ruel, who was going to sell it for her. She said, "Dispose of it," she wrote in 1912 to her dealer, Durand-Ruel. "It has artistic qualities, but it is painful to me and represents me as a person so repugnant that I do not want anyone to know that I posed for it." The dealer was happy to oblige, and so he sold it to a Danish collector. Eventually, of course, again, you can never control your own image. It got back to the US, and it's now in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. But she seems to have hated it so much that she did a redo, which is what this portrait is here. It's a watercolor. It was done quickly. But you get the sense that she hated the Degas so much that she thought, okay, I can do better than this. She's wearing the same clothes. You can see it's this tailored suit, the same hat, and she has a gold bow at her neck and a gold bow on the hat. But in this case, she's not leaning over in this very unladylike way with her elbows on her knees. She's sitting straight up and she's at work. She is painting. She is who she wants to be in this self-portrait. And it's this, whatever, I'm guessing that the photograph that she had made for this image was based on that, the improvement of what other people like Degas thought she should look like. She did have photographs made of herself later, but whenever she could avoid it, she tried not to have them published in any way. So after her death, her claim to fame, her recognition, what came in 1988 when a US postage stamp was made of her image, based obviously on the photograph that we see here, which was by that time in the Archives of American Art in Washington. And she would have been horrified, I think, to see what that engraver, what that person did who took the photograph and redid it for this stamp. Instead of the elegant hat and the beautiful fur and the great amethyst necklace and, her terrific posture, they focus on her face and this little grungy thing at the top. And, I'm sure she would have been like, again, the compromise between wanting fame and having to let go of your own image. What do you think Jane Austen thinks about the 10-pound note? Do you think she would be upset to know that that image was on that bill? Here it is. It's recognition. And by the way, I think she would have been happy to know that she's on a 10-pound note and Mary Cassatt was only on a 23-cent stamp. I think she would have been happy about that. But let's look at where this comes from and what this image says to the world. If you asked her in 1813 what her portrait should be like, she said in a letter to her sister, Cassandra, quote, "I do not despair of having my picture in the exhibition at last, all white and red with my head on one side." What would that have been? What was she thinking of? If you look at the exhibition of Sir Joshua Reynolds in 1813 in London, which she did go to, and thanks to Janine Barkas for recreating it on her website, What Jane Saw, this incredible portrait of Lady Jane Stanhope would have stood right out. Here she was, sort of the central figure in this exhibition. Would Jane Austen have seen herself in this portrait? Is this what she would like to have in an exhibition? Or in terms of a half-length portrait, we have all kinds of possibilities. Sir Thomas Lawrence painting Dorothea von Leven, who was the wife of the Russian ambassador to England and was a great socialite, apparently introduced the waltz to London. These are celebrity portraits. Or John Hopner's portrait of Isabella Ann Seymour Conway, done around 1800. You can tell it's right at the last minute of powdered hair. This same woman was painted around 1813 in miniature by Anne Folston Mee. We think that there aren't that many famous women artists at the time, but there really were, and they worked in all kinds of mediums. And maybe because this is tiny, this is like 5x7 ivory watercolor, and the same woman as this, only now without the powdered hair. Was Jane Austen thinking that she was that kind of celebrity? Or was she thinking more of the portraits of famous women of accomplishment, like Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun's portrait of Margaret Chinnery, who now Vigée Lebrun was one of the great portraitists of Paris before the French Revolution. And then once the revolution ousted so many aristocrats from Paris, she spent the rest of her career traveling around Europe and was in London in 1803 and painted Mrs. Chinnery, who was a great intellectual, a great woman of letters. Or, of course, Fanny Burney, who Jane Austen adored in terms of her novels and learned a lot about female accomplishment from Fanny Burney. Or even Celeste Cottolini on the right, who was a singer, an Italian singer who had a great career traveling and performing around Europe, and then settled in Italy and was painted by Antoine-Jean Gros, who was one of the great pupils of David in Paris at the turn of the century, in the early 19th century. You think this might be what she was thinking of when we look at what we actually have of Jane Austen, and we're like, oh my God, here she's thinking of herself as a Reynolds heroine, of a great woman of accomplishment, of Fanny Burney, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what do we have? We have this tiny little drawing, unfinished drawing, about which we know very, very little. It was something that was not discussed during her lifetime. There's no record of it being done. It doesn't even see, it obviously went into her estate. Cassandra inherited it after her death, and then eventually got into the hands of Cassandra's heirs, the nieces and nephews of their brothers and sisters. What could she have been thinking? What was this? It just raises so many questions. First of all, did Cassandra do this? If so, I mean, Cassandra lived for another, 20 or 30 years. She could have finished it. Was it a sketch or something? She could have done the finished work, but no, nothing done of it. Is it even Jane Austen? Here, we don't have a record of it. There's no identification of it. The nieces and nephews thought it was Jane Austen, but what do they know? Some of them weren't even born when before Jane Austen died. And if it is by Cassandra, and if it is of Jane, what would it have been used for? What was the purpose of this little drawing? So I'm just going to propose a couple of things. And again, like the Cassatt feeling about the Degas portrait of her, Jane Austen's niece, Anna Lefroy, said about this little drawing, the drawing I did not like at all. The figure being so hideously unlike. It's like, oh, please, here we have a great woman. Let's have a great portrait. But no, we don't. We have something hideously unlike, as she said. Jane Austen could have had Reynolds or Romney or Hopner paint her portrait. There were portraits by these artists in her family. This Reynolds portrait of her aunt Philadelphia and cousin Eliza. Her brother Edward Austen had this portrait on the left painted in Europe when he was on the Grand Tour, because he was adopted by the knights who were childless, and they adopted him as a child, and he then inherited all of their work, including the portraits. So Jane would have known all of this. But instead, no, this is a drawing. This is a little portrait drawing. And there is a genre of portrait drawings that's important. And maybe this drawing belongs to it. And I'm quoting here, this is Jane Austen writing to Cassandra. I mean to confine myself in future to Mr. Tom Lefroy, for whom I don't care a sixpence. Assure her also, as a last and indubitable proof of Warren's indifference to me, Warren being another friend, that he actually drew that gentleman's picture for me and delivered it to me without a sigh. So to me, this shows how common it was for the kids, the people, the young men and women in her circle to do portraits of each other and give them to other friends. These portraits were not meant to be stuck with the subject. They were meant to be given away. They were meant to be gifts or circulated to show what people looked like. And one of the greatest portrait draftsmen of that time was Ingres, again in France, in Paris at the time, did many incredible portrait drawings, small portrait drawings, commissioned, meant to be in circulation. This particular one was suggested by Jeffrey Nigro in his essay in the book Jane Austen and the Arts. And he mentions it because of the crossed arms and talks about how Jane and her niece would not have been happy with this pose because it was more typically a pose for a man. But it's possible that Jane Austen was happy to have a pose with her arms crossed. It resembles, it suggests the portrait of Fanny Burney, for instance, which was known widely through prints, or the portrait of the singer, where for a woman of accomplishment, a woman on stage, a woman taking her place in the world, this pose of the crossed arms would have been perfectly appropriate. And for speaking of Fanny Burney and her portrait and the engravings of her portrait, this would have been a typical author portrait. Eventually, the author portrait um, became standard for Fanny Burney's novels. And we think that this drawing of Jane Austen has been dated around 1810 based on costume, but it's also about the time when Sense and Sensibility has been accepted by a publisher. So here's Jane Austen thinking, well, maybe I need an author portrait. Maybe I need something like Fanny Burney's portrait. And the oval pencil line above may suggest that she was thinking of it as something that would be like an author portrait, a frontispiece in a book. The idea of having her portrait in a book would have appealed to Jane Austen. She liked portraits in books. In her, history of England, she had Cassandra do in oval format the portraits of the kings and queens of England that she was writing about. Many people think that it's possible that Cassandra based her images of Mary, Queen of Scots on Jane. There's this little chin, the big wide eyes. There is something of a similarity between the portrait drawing and Mary, Queen of Scots. But if we look at Cassandra Austen's drawings, her body of work, which is very small, I haven't been able to find too much that she did, but the few things that we have by her that are pretty solidly by her, she tends to be a very stylish draftsman. She loves the curved line. She loves the flowing hair and the flowing fabric. Very elegant, very delicate, very lively. And in comparison, the portrait that we're looking at of Jane Austen doesn't seem to have those characteristics. Does not mean, since we don't have much of a body of work of Cassandra, doesn't mean she didn't do it. Maybe she was trying deliberately to make the portrait seem stiff, seem almost anachronistic. If you look at, again, galleries of engraved portraits of famous people, like this one, a collection of engraved portraits of illustrious and eminent personages dated around 1800. The few women who are represented in this collection are kings and queens, or the queens or royalty of England. Mary, Queen of Scots, of course, or Margaret, the daughter of James I. And particularly, I'm struck by, intrigued by the long neck, the wooden pose of the figure, even the somewhat crossed hands that have not a sense of flowing active life, but of the almost the religious icon, the figure who has become immortal and is in a sort of idealized static pose. Now we can not eliminate the possibility that this little drawing was meant ultimately to become a watercolor miniature on ivory, a little oval portrait, again, a gift item that people would have made to give to other people. There was, and if this portrait wasn't done by Cassandra Austen, it could have been done by George Jackson, who was in the area doing these miniature portraits. The miniaturists tended to be itinerant and would go around and stay at people's houses and do their portraits. You can see this particular artist is very detailed in terms of the face and not particularly flattering. However, again, it could have been made into a miniature if that was the intention for this drawing, and it was not. And Cassandra Austen had many family miniatures that were part of her estate and then bequeathed to her nieces and nephews. This was not. Is it Jane Austen? I was like, well, it could be anybody. These drawings are passed around. One person does it for their friends. Just because it ends up in somebody's estate when they die doesn't mean it's necessarily of them or by them. But if you look at the drawing next to images of other members of the Cassatt family, like her father, here is a miniature of her father. They have that same little pointy chin. There's a kind of jowl-like curve to the cheeks. The mouth particularly intrigues me. Just a little thin mouth, downturned. You can tell, ready to crack a joke, perhaps, be sarcastic. These hollowed out eyes. But even more so, here's a photograph of James Edward Austen Leigh, who was Jane Austen's oldest nephew and the author of the memoir, who was looking for a portrait of Jane Austen to reproduce in the memoir. And to me, again, the tight little mouth, the little chin, the jowl-like effect, the heavy eyes, bags under the eyes, if you will. There's a family resemblance there. So I'm willing to accept it as Jane Austen. Her nieces and nephews certainly accepted it as Jane Austen. So there you have it. I mean, I'm not going to quibble with it beyond that. However, you still have the problem of it not being very flattering. And all of the nieces and nephews agreed that she was attractive. I mean, they were kids, but they thought she was attractive. This is from Austen Leigh's memoir. Her figure was rather tall and slender, her step light and firm, and her whole appearance expressive of health and animation. In complexion, she was a clear brunette with a rich color. She had full round cheeks with mouth and nose small and well-formed, bright hazel eyes, and brown hair forming natural curls close around her face. This description of her seems like it's something written looking at this portrait, but thinking she's got to be better than that. So James Edward Austen Leigh commissioned James Edward Andrews to do an improved version of the hideous portrait that they had to work with. Thinking, it's sort of like to me, like a police sketch, taking someone's words and trying to put it into a visual image based on the original drawing, but trying to recognize what the nieces and nephews remembered of her in terms of being a lively, attractive person. It was this drawing then that Austen Leigh used for the memoir. He gave that to the engraver. The engraver then created his own image of Jane Austen. And that was for the frontispiece. And then that in turn was used for the portrait gallery of eminent men and women of Europe and America, which is the image that we've been looking at all along. Does it look like Jane Austen? The nieces and nephews didn't even think so. Jane Austen certainly didn't think so. But did she care? Well, maybe she didn't care. Maybe it was fine as long as people thought it looked like her, or believed that it would look like her if they didn't know her. She wanted to be in the book. She wanted to be part of what she was sending out into the world. Now, again, it's difficult. It's a compromise because the book is all about how she was a private domestic person, homebound, thinking only of her family and friends when she was writing her novels, which of course was complete nonsense. She was looking to the wider world for her novels. So I think in comparison, she would have been much happier with the redo of that portrait, not because of what it looked like, because it's getting less and less like her, but because it was in a portrait gallery that recognized her work. It had nothing to do with what she looked like. Again, it would talk about how she was a private person and worked from home, but she was with the greatest men and women of Europe and America. And that is what would have made her happy with this portrait. Having that kind of recognition is something that being in a portrait gallery gives you. A portrait gallery, thinking of it as a museum. Now, Jane Austen, who was an artist, actually could have her work in a museum, in an actual museum. And in her lifetime, she had many of her major works acquired by museums in the United States and in Europe, both the figure paintings and the mother and child images. She lived to see her fame, and she lived to see her work taken care of, immortalized, because of where it ended up, because her work was entering into museums. And at this time, she writes to her friend Louisine Havemeyer, perhaps they are right when they say I will survive. Who knows? But surviving was what she was after. And it wasn't just what she looked like, but what she did. For Jane Austen, yes, she was in the gallery of famous people, the portrait gallery of famous people in this book, but she is also immortalized by bookshelves like these. It's not a museum, but it is a bookshelf, and it's my bookshelf. And it means I've been reading her work for hundreds of times. But even more than that, I mean, I think she would have been happy because it is 2021 and I'm still reading it. But she might have been even happier, because Mary Cassatt read her book, because Mary Cassatt was somebody that she could look up to, because this was someone like her, a peer, someone also of accomplishment. And for her, if she could know that Mary Cassatt said, I would rather go back and read Miss Austen's novels over again for the 100th time, that would have been enough. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Nancy. Thank you so much. So we do have a few questions.
Okay, let me,
Okay.
I'm going to put the portrait gallery on.
That's good.
Let me see who I'm talking to.
Okay. So the first question was, okay, with the article about the female artist, New York Ladies article.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of the other artists, but who were some of the other artists in that article?
And I do not recognize the other artists in the article. So I can't tell you. They're not anyone more famous than Rhoda Holmes Nichols or Eliza Greatorix. But I'm happy if somebody would like a reference to that, I can give it to them. If they give me, they could email me. I put my email address on the introductory slide. So if anybody has any questions or wants that kind of documentation, I can share it with them.
That's great. And then also you, at that point in the talk, you were talking about Cassatt's reaction to that. What did she say about the patronizing tone of some of the descriptions of her and her work?
Well, she grew by the end of the century, by the late 90s. She was pretty clear in her mind that the American press was more patronizing than the French press. And so she preferred being in Paris, and felt that the recognition of the French critics and public collectors, et cetera, was definitely more important than the American. However, it's hard to be in control of your reputation. And as time went on, the American collectors and critics embraced her more and more. By 1915, she was one of the 5 most important American women. She got recognition beyond anyone's wildest dreams. So, you can't complain.
Another question is about the portraits that are attributed to Cassandra Austen, and how they look so different. The one with her back that's more watercolor and softer.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that, like the differences? I mean, you really went into a lot of detail about which, who might have been the actual artist, but any other thoughts on that?
Well, I have to say, I think Cassandra Austen had a lot of verve as obviously an amateur artist, but many people have pointed out that she did a lot of copying of prints, and the studies, the watercolor studies that we have, the one of the so-called Jane Austen from the back, seems to relate to fashion engravings. That's been pointed out many times. But the characteristics that you see in the history of England images, and the 2 watercolors that I showed, Fanny Price and the Jane Austen from the back, they are much more flowing, much more decorative, much more like fashion images than the drawing, the portrait drawing. So it does give you pause, but we just don't know enough. We don't know. We don't have enough of a body of work for Cassandra Austen, in my view, from an art historian's point of view, to be able to say for sure. It's possible. I cannot rule it out that she was just trying something different, trying to make Jane Austen appear iconic, the way the Tudor queens were done in a very iconic way. Think of the very stiff portraits of Queen Elizabeth, for instance. Those would have been done in that same manner. So there's a touch of that in the drawing, the portrait drawing of Jane Austen.
Another question relating to that: how long would it have taken someone like Cassandra, like an amateur artist, to do a sketch like that like basic sketch?
The watercolor sketch or the portrait?
The portrait.
Oh, an afternoon, a couple of hours or an hour, not long. Because it's not that finished. I mean, if you think of the scene in Emma, of Emma doing the portrait drawing, that took several days, but it was a finished work, and it was a full figure, not just a, half length head. So if it had gotten to completion in whatever it was intended for, it would have taken longer than whoever it was that worked on it, that we see today.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions about the Degas painting. And one is, what does she have in her hands? And the other question is, why would, since they were friends, why would he have done such an unflattering portrait of her?
Well, Degas, you had to have a lot of strength to be a friend of Edgar Degas. He was somebody without a filter. He would say the meanest things to people. Here's an example. He went to an opening of a young artist, and that young man was so thrilled to have Degas, the famous Edgar Degas, come to his opening. So he went up to him, and Degas says, "Is this your work?" And the guy says, "Yes, yes, thank you, Mr. Degas." And Degas says, "I pity you." It's like, who does that? Who does that to his face? So that's just what you have to put up with when you are friends with Degas and you agree to sit for your portrait by Degas. It could be anything. It could be anything. And honestly, I think she liked it. Well, she liked Degas. She thought he was the greatest artist of their generation, of their day. So for her to have that work, and she had other works by him, but this meant a lot to her, I think, to have it just pure Degas painting. But again, she didn't want it to go out in public. She didn't want it to be part of the international discourse about her. It's fine. She liked it just fine as a painting, but she didn't want her name to be attached to it. So anyway, they were all crazy, all the Impressionists. You had to be kind of weird to be in that group. They were all, they all said weird things and played jokes on one another. And, it was fun too. I mean, if you could take it, if you had the strength.
Interesting. Another question is, well, it's really more of a comment, but I'd like to hear your comment about this. Jane Austen doesn't describe what her characters look like for the most part. It's more left to the imagination. So maybe she wouldn't mind if we didn't know what she really looked like.
Right.
Thoughts on that?
I would agree and I would disagree. The fact that she thought what her portrait might look like, even if it were a joke, the idea of, there may still be time for my portrait to be in the exhibition, all white and red and, with my head to one side. She was thinking big, thinking important work of art here. So, on the one hand, she had that in her to think of herself as among the great celebrities of her day, both socialites and women of accomplishment. But, I think like Cassatt, she probably had an inkling. She died before she could really see it evolve. But, your reputation gets out of hand so quickly. And there's so many people who are jealous or, can say as much as people loved her work, she had her critics. And, that's always hard to take. So she may perhaps, like Cassatt, would have tried to restrict her image or make it more flattering as Cassatt did. We just don't know because she died right. If you compare the two of them, Cassatt was just beginning to be famous at 41 when Jane Austen died. So we don't know what she would have done with fame if she had lived a good long life.
a couple of, could you turn off, is that your screen sharing? Are you still screen sharing, or we're having a screen that shows Felicia? Just trying to get rid of that. A couple of people asked about that.
Okay,
That
let
you, or is that
me,
someone else?
I'm not screen sharing. I mean, I haven't done anything, but except, let me see. Yes, I am screen sharing, but it's a black slide, but I'll stop it.
Okay, perfect. That'd be great.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, great. Oh, no problem. Did Mary Cassatt ever paint Degas?
Yes, theoretically, there is a mention of a Degas portrait, but it is not known. There is no image that seems to be of Degas.
And how did you get interested in both Austen and Cassatt? I mean, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, as I said, I was given a Jane Austen book, I think when I was 12, and I never looked back. That was it for me. I just went on, and I went to college. When I went to college at 18, I went to Goucher College, which has one of the early editions of Emma. So, I immediately signed up for a Jane Austen seminar, which is when I got the Chapman set of books. So it's, just been lifelong. Of course, now I have them all on Kindle and searchable. So, but Cassatt, when I needed a dissertation topic, which was in the early 70s, I knew I wanted to do a female artist, and my field was the late 19th century. And I figured I could either do Cassatt or Morisot. And I looked at their work and I thought I would prefer to work on Cassatt. So that's, and again, you don't look back once you're on that track. You're like,
Yeah.
There's so much that's interesting about this artist.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
This is another, not quite a question, but about the fact that the 10-pound note with Jane Austen the background is Godmersham Park, which is not where she wrote. So it's not really representing her working life either. Any comments on that? It's like a recurring theme.
I don't know. I didn't know that. But yeah, I mean, these things, I mean, when you now, we're considering Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. And you look at the image that they've gotten of Harriet Tubman, and, Harriet Tubman would turn over in her grave. She was like, can't you do any better than that? It's like your image just gets so out of control, so out of your hands. But by that time, historical figures are long dead. You can't get a new image of them. You have to work with what you have. And usually it's not very flattering, whatever was done during your lifetime. So then, for women, somebody tries to pretty them up, usually, and it just ends up getting less and less like them. Or they reinterpret them. Like I think the stamp, whoever did the engraving for the stamp had an idea of Cassatt that is different from mine. Let me just put it that way. And I think probably different from hers, but I'm just guessing.
I think we've gone through all the questions. Does anybody have a question I missed or any additional questions? Feel free to raise your hand or type in. And I'll share the comment. Anybody who came in late or missed part of it for any reason, we will post this on our YouTube channel. I'll send a link out to everyone. And we'll also share the chat because there's a lot of great commentary in the chat, including Carol and Crew Graves was kind enough to enter Nancy's email address into the chat. So that's in there as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we have a few more messages. Let's see. A lot of thanks. It's another question about not really a question, but a comment about the the 10-pound note, which has a Caroline Bingley quote, which is an ironic quote that's taken out of context. But that's another, again, the image and the misuse of some of the irony in Austen is always an ongoing issue.
I didn't even know that. I'll have to look for it. I was just looking at the image, at the picture, not at the portrait of her, not really examining the whole context. Now I have to go back. The 10-pound note is the subject of another lecture, I think.
Although one question we did kind of gloss over is what was in Cassatt's hands in the Degas portrait? Do we know?
Yeah, well, actually, there's a dispute about what could be. I think she's holding a bunch of small pieces of paper that some people thought might be playing cards. But in my opinion, they are photographs. They're shaped, they're in a kind of rectangular shape, which is the shape of a type of photograph called a carte de visite, which is in the form of a calling card, that kind of rectangular shape, but it's a photograph. So that if you go visiting, you could just leave your photograph. You wouldn't have to, you wouldn't have a printed card. So that's but we really don't know what she had in her hand. And she seems to be in his studio rather than her. By that time, she at one point had her own studio separate from her apartment. When her parents first came to live with her, this is another thing. She was very close to her sister, but in this case, her sister died young, and she lived with her parents for the rest of their lives. So when they first came, she got her own studio, but that only lasted for a while. Mostly she worked out of her home.
And another question, did Cassatt know Renoir?
Oh, yes, of course. They were all friends. They worked together to produce these exhibitions, the Impressionist exhibitions. And so they spent a lot of time together. And as they got older, they were old, by that time, they were old friends. And Cassatt had a winter home near Renoir in the south of France. So the two of them got to be good friends in later years.
Someone commented that they wish that a portrait had been done of her by Renoir.
There are a lot of proposed portraits of Cassatt. I stay away from them. I mean, the only ones that I know that are documented are the ones that I showed you.
Do you have any thoughts on the Rice portrait, the repeated portrait of Austen?
No. I know just enough about that to stay away from it. I don't know how you would unravel that. It's certainly on appearances, it doesn't look to me like it would be her, or what the circumstances would be that portrait would have been done of her as a child. But that would take some luck, in my opinion, to come across some kind of document that would really authenticate that work.
Makes sense. Yeah. I think that's all the questions. Anybody else? Any last parting questions? I know we have lots of thank yous in the chat. Everyone really enjoyed this so much. It's just been absolutely wonderful. We're so grateful you took the time to give us this wonderful presentation.
Oh, well, thank you. You were a great audience. I mean, I miss, of course, having the real audience, but, I just kept thinking, this is just like what Jane Austen and Mary Cassatt would have done. They are writing their letters or writing their books and doing their art and having no feedback, no interaction with their audience. It all has to be mental thinking, what would these people like, or what are they how are they receiving this? So it gives, I think, gives us insight into that era. And I found it amazing how much I learned about Mary Cassatt from studying Jane Austen and vice versa. I thought there were a lot of ways that the two of them, a study of the two of them can help us understand each other, the other one. So anyway, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And you know, if you have any questions or want any documentation, I think my email address is in the chat somewhere, but it's also on the front slide of the talk. So you can always find it there.
And I'll send it out in the email to everybody who registered along with the link to the video.
Okay.
So,
all right, great. Well, thank
you
you.
again.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Nancy. Everybody can unmute and do a little applause if you like.
Thank
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Stay
you.
warm and safe, everybody, in cold areas.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you. And Janet and Susie, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your, everything that you did for this.
Oh, thank you, Nancy.
Absolutely.
We're so grateful. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Okay, I'm leaving.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Susie, hold on a minute. I
Okay.
wanted to turn off